You wake up to the familiar feeling of four walls pressing against you. It's dark, except for the slivers of light leaking through the space between the walls and the lid of the cooler that you have been hiding in for over a year. It's been 320 days since you've seen or spoken to another human. Well, a living one at least. And it's been even longer since you've set foot on dry land. All the while, you've spent every day and every night curled up inside this cooler to protect yourself from the elements. But right now, you need to leave your shelter to check to see if the water jugs caught any rain overnight before the sun gets too hot. You push open the lid and are temporarily blinded by a bright morning sun in an otherwise empty blue sky. Stepping out onto the floor of your small boat, you look out at your surroundings and are unsurprised by what you see. Nothing. Nothing but water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. Looking down at your rain jugs, you are disappointed to see that they are completely dry. Another day of drinking your own urine it is then. Defeated, you turn around to return to the confines of your cooler when the strangest thing happens. You see something on the horizon. Jose Alvarenga was born in 1975 in El Salvador. In 2002, he left for Mexico to work as a fisherman. Under the employ of Villarmino Rodriguez, he considered the sea and his fellow fishermen as his family. November 17th, 2012, dawned overcast but fair. Jose decided to go for a deep-sea fishing trip out into the Pacific Ocean. He would be out for 30 arduous hours in the unforgiving elements of the open sea, but he deemed it worth it. The potential yield of mahi-mahis, marlins, sharks, and sailfish in these rich fishing grounds would bring enough money to sustain him for a week. However, there was one problem. Whether he had received a premonition of the horrors to come or just happened to wake up on the wrong side of the bed that day, Jose's usual fishing partner could not join him at the last minute of this particular trip. But undeterred by this setback, Jose found himself a replacement, Ezekiel Cordoba, a young, inexperienced 23-year-old he barely knew. Jose was an experienced sailor and fisherman. He knew he might run into bad weather, but he knew these waters quite well. And anyway, they wouldn't be out for more than one day. Confident of a good catch, the two men set out on a 23-foot fiberglass skiff. The vessel was equipped with a single outboard motor, a refrigerator-sized cooler for storing fish, ice for keeping their catch fresh, some floating buoys, 16 gallons of water, 70 gallons of gasoline, and various fishing equipment. Other than an old two-way radio with half-charged batteries and a GPS that wasn't waterproof, they carried no communication devices or other electronics. They also left without an anchor or any crucial navigational devices, so no charts or maps, flare guns, or a signaling light. The boat also didn't have sails or oars.
A deep-sea expedition without the proper equipment. An experienced fisherman such as himself should know that the sea is not kind to overconfidence.
Well, if he didn't know then, he would certainly learn. After all, this overlook unfortunately became the catalyst for an unimaginably hellish series of events. From the small fishing village of Costa Azul, Jose and Ezekiel motored 120 kilometers away from the coast to start their fishing expedition. At first, they had a good yield of 500 kilos of fresh fish, but at 1 a.m., a violent storm hit them. Caught in the fury of the storm, powerful 5-meter-high waves crashed, and heavy rain poured into the open-topped boat, dumping gallons upon gallons of water into the small vessel. The wind screamed with all its intensity, easily tossing the skiff around. Nature seemed to be deciding whether to sink or flip their skiff over. Using a bucket, Ezekiel desperately bailed water back into the sea while Jose steered, fighting the massive waves. But this time, the storm was so strong that harbor masters on the shore prohibited fishing boats from heading out to sea. It was too much. The two men decided to start heading back towards the shore as fast as they could. Bailing out the deluge of water, battling the power of the waves and wind, and trembling in the cold, the two men fought tooth and nail in a desperate race to reach Costa Azul. Jose held on to the tiller, his face full of concentration, and expertly guided the skiff to ride the waves like a surfer determined to get home in one piece. All things considered, Jose was relatively calm and composed. As an experienced fisherman, he had been in situations like this before. In contrast, the inexperienced Ezekiel was stricken with terror. After all, he was not a seaman. He was just a kid, one of the players in the village's soccer team. He had agreed to accompany Jose to make $50. Heck, he and Jose had never even spoken before. Soaking wet, cold, and terrified of sharks, Ezekiel simply stopped bailing after hours of being tossed about in the boat. He merely screamed in panic and held on to the rails. At 9 a.m., during a brief cloud opening during the storm, the men caught sight of land on the horizon 24 miles away. A surging ray of hope filled the soaked duo as they became certain that salvation was within their grasp. They would reach the shore, share this crazy mishap with their friends, and laugh about it. But then came a stroke of bad luck that sealed their fates. The single outboard motor sputtered and conked out. Try as they did to restart the engine, the two men only succeeded in breaking the cord needed to pull start the motor. In a panic, Jose radioed in his boss, Villarmino Rodriguez, to request help. But without a working GPS or chart, there was no way Jose could pinpoint their location for the rescue party. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, the radio's battery died, killing any hope or further communication with anyone. The storm continued to rage. Concerned that their heavy 500-pound catch was increasing their odds of capsizing, they dumped their precious cargo, the gasoline, and most of their fishing equipment overboard. Jose also tied 50 of the fishing buoys to the sides of the boat as floating anchors to provide further stability and drag. But since they had neglected to take any oars, sails, or anchors with them, the men had nothing to stop their boat from drifting farther out into the Pacific Ocean. Jose and Ezekiel stared in disbelief as the mountains grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared. For 5 days, the storm blew them hundreds of miles away from the shore, which had, at one point, been within easy reach. Both men methodically bailed out water from the skiff as the storm continued to pummel them. They were extremely cold and exhausted, but they knew they could not stop. Otherwise, the water accumulation would sink their boat. Jose vented out his anger by smashing the broken outboard engine with a club that he used to kill fish and angrily threw all of their useless electronics overboard into the deep blue abyss. Both men were soaking wet and dreadfully cold, and they urgently needed to find protection from the gale force winds. They turned their empty cooler upside down, making it a makeshift bunkhouse, and curled up inside. Inside, they hugged tightly, using their own body heat to warm each other. They knew the bailing should not stop, so they took turns leaving the cooler to bail out the water in 10 to 15 minute stints. When the storm finally abated, Jose and Ezekiel could fully grasp the truly terrifying scope of the situation they were in. They were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no land in sight. There was nothing but the immensity of a blue void that stretched beyond the horizon in all directions. At this point, the men had been swept 450 kilometers away from land, much farther than they had ever planned to go, even when they had a working motor. With much of their fishing gear lost or damaged in the storm, the men were left with only the shirts on their backs and a bit of food. They were alone, and their ordeal was just the beginning. But you would think that since Jose was able to get a call into his boss back on shore, a search party would be sent out and surely the two lost fishermen would eventually be found.
One does not simply search the Pacific for a small boat. As far as places to be lost on Earth, this is one of the worst. With a surface area of more than 165 million square kilometers, the Pacific Ocean covers a massive 1/3 of the Earth's surface and contains half of the world's ocean water. It is so incomprehensibly vast that all the world's landmass could theoretically fit within the Pacific Ocean and still leave some space to spare. It contains the deepest and darkest ravines on the planet and remains mostly unexplored. It even has the truest definition of the planet of being nowhere. Point Nemo, a location in the middle of the Pacific, which is 1,670 miles from land, making it the most isolated coordinate on Earth.
Hot take? There's too much ocean. Jose's employer did send a search and rescue party when he received their distress call, but the group could not find a trace of the boat due to poor visibility. The party gave up after 2 days of searching the area where they were last seen, which, at that point, the two men had already drifted hundreds of miles from anyway, carried by the ocean currents. Each day that Jose and Ezekiel spent exposed to the harsh elements of the open ocean was worse than the last. Because their boat did not have a raised structure or a lower deck, there was absolutely no protection from the intense sunshine during the day. The full power of the hot tropical sun beat down on the two nearly naked men, leading to painful sunburns. Temperatures in the open ocean went up to more than 30 degrees Celsius. The dry air evaporated the moisture from their body. Welts began to form on the tight and shrunken skin of their arms and legs as their lips became cracked and swollen. The salty breeze caused salt crystals to form on their tattered clothes and everywhere on their body, causing their skin to chafe. The nights were no better. Bitterly cold wind blew over their bodies, and the cold was worse when they were drenched by rain waves that washed over their boat. The only real shelter that they had, if you can call it a shelter, was the cooler that they used to store fish in. They huddled together inside to protect themselves against the elements. Originally used to store fish, the cooler stank terribly. It was painful to squeeze 2 human bodies into the container, but they were willing to endure this discomfort and inconvenience for the protection it provided from the glaring sun, cold wind, and punishing waves. But with their meager food supplies exhausted and fishing equipment lost in the storm, Jose and Ezekiel wouldn't be able to just hide in the cooler all day. They would have to get to work figuring out a solution to their food problem, and fast, before they starved to death. Not only was Jose a skilled and experienced fisherman, but an incredibly patient one as well. He would kneel over the side of the boat with his arms submerged up to his shoulders and wait with his hands in the water, held as still as possible, just inches apart. When a fish would swim between his hands, he'd bring his hands together around the fish with lightning speed, digging his fingernails into its scales. Ezekiel would then cut up and prepare the fish for eating or drying. Sometimes, Jose was even able to catch an occasional seabird or turtle that strayed too close to the boat. There was no stove or cooking fire, so the 2 men had to eat their catch raw or dried, making the risk of salmonella and other parasites very real. Despite this, their raging hunger was almost too much to bear. They supplemented their fish by eating jellyfish, bearing the pain of the venomous stings. At times, Jose was so hungry that he resorted to eating his overgrown fingernails, not wasting any small pieces. To make the food more palatable, the men imagined that what they were eating were delicacies of their favorite dishes. But finding water was a different story. Sure, they had an incomprehensible amount of water all around them, but drinking seawater is a death sentence. That's because seawater contains a very high concentration of salt, much higher than the human body can process. To get rid of that excess salt, a person would have to urinate more water than they drank. To account for that needed fluid to flush out the salt, the body is forced to drain precious H2O from its cells. Ironically, a person becomes thirstier and will ultimately die of dehydration faster by drinking seawater. To get drinkable water, the 2 men collected rainfall when possible using plastic bottles that they found floating in the ocean. But rain came in sporadically, so they often faced a shortage of fresh drinking water. In fact, as they spent the first 9 days aimlessly adrift after the storm, not one drop of water fell down from the sky. During periods of drought like this, their plan B would be to drink blood, sea turtle blood. When Jose caught a turtle, they would flip the animal over onto its back and quickly slit its throat. They would catch the pouring blood in a bottle or bowl and drink the warm, thick liquid. The blood was repugnant with a salty, metallic taste and a revolting scent. At first, the 2 men had to hold onto their guts and force themselves to swallow. Drinking it was also dangerous. Turtle blood can carry pathogens and parasites that could cause serious illness. But often, they weren't able to catch enough turtles. So, when they didn't have rainwater or rancid turtle blood, they had to resort to Plan P, drinking their own urine. It was Jose who first began to drink his urine. Taking a tentative sip, he gagged at the acrid, ammonia-laden taste of his own urine. The foul, salty bitterness coated his tongue, but it was not as repulsive as he thought it would be. He peed, and drank again, in a cycle that, like drinking seawater, was actually worsening his dehydration. And despite this, he coaxed Ezekiel to do the same. To keep their sanity and a semblance of normality, Jose and Ezekiel talked to each other about their personal lives. They spoke about their parents, their regrets, and their dreams. Jose frequently thought about his daughter and how he missed her, while Ezekiel talked about his mother. Both men also reminisced about how badly they behaved toward their parents. They imagined hugging and kissing them. At times, they prayed and asked for forgiveness from God. And even though it was the source of their despair, both men were awed at the magnificent expanse of the Pacific Ocean. They admired the beautiful sunrises and stunning sunsets with no land to impede their view of nature's spectacle. As weeks and months passed by, the 2 men established a routine that kept their spirits up. However, 4 months into their ordeal, Ezekiel became sick after eating raw seabird meat. His mouth began to froth, his stomach cramped in agony. He even spat out the fresh rainwater that Jose tried to give him. Alarmed, Jose dissected the bird that Ezekiel had eaten. There, they found the remains of a venomous yellow-bellied sea snake. The 2 men began to worry. Did the venom enter Ezekiel's bloodstream? Was it fatal? They tried to remember what they heard about the yellow-bellied snake. All third-hand accounts of fellow fishermen who stayed away from these creatures. Thankfully, within 2 days, Ezekiel didn't seem to be poisoned and made a full recovery. But the shock and terror of possibly having ingested the poison held him in an iron grip. He vehemently refused any bird meat that Jose offered to him from then on. The trauma of the seabird experience, coupled with the depression of being lost at sea for so long, severely eroded Ezekiel's mental sanity. Clenching his teeth, Ezekiel refused to eat any of the food that Jose gave to him, further sapping his strength. His physical and psychological state deteriorated more and more with each passing day, despite Jose's coaxing and offers. His arms looked like twigs, and his thighs were the thickness of a forearm. As Ezekiel's situation worsened, the two men made a pact. If one of them died, the survivor would visit the deceased person's family. Feeling himself slipping away, Ezekiel also pleaded with Jose not to eat him if he perished. Jose solemnly gave the dying Ezekiel his promise, but still implored his depressed companion not to give up on life. On their 118th day at sea, as Jose attempted to give Ezekiel some water, his companion's body suddenly couldn't take the strain anymore. Violent convulsions racked his body as Jose tried to pass fresh water to his lips. Moments later, Ezekiel's body went limp. He was dead. Jose was truly alone, and the sea, uncaring, continued to push his boat farther and farther into the unknown. At first, Jose just had to overcome the impossible task of surviving. Now, he also had to deal with the mental toll of being alone, and that is even more difficult than you might think. Humans are social creatures, and without someone to interact with, extreme loneliness can exert a tremendous amount of physical and mental stress. Psychologically, lonely people become inefficient in dealing with stressful situations. Severe depression can set in. Isolated people may have problems in processing information, making decisions, and remembering things. They can experience anxiety and panic attacks, increased levels of paranoia, and bouts of hallucinations. Not only that, but researchers also found that extreme loneliness can compromise the immune system. If you're lonely, you're more likely to get sick. Scientists who spend their time alone in remote outposts and astronauts who spend months in the International Space Station consider prolonged loneliness as the most difficult part of their jobs. In his sorrow and loneliness, Jose kept Ezekiel's remains on the skiff, talking to the body as if his friend was still alive. He confessed his secrets, cried out his frustrations, asked him how he slept, and so on. 6 nights later, while in the middle of reflecting with the rotting corpse in a full-on one-sided conversation under a clear moonlit sky, Jose suddenly realized the reality of what he was doing and began to accept the harsh truth that his friend was gone, and he wasn't coming back. He also became concerned that his constant conversation with a dead body was the first sign that he was losing his mental acuity. And even though it would have been crucial for his survival to eat Ezekiel's flesh, he honored his pact and let Ezekiel rest in peace by a burial at sea. At first, you might think the idea that cannibalism was even considered here is absurd, but in extremely desperate survival situations, it has been known to happen. For example, we previously made a video about the 1972 Uruguayan Air Force Flight 551 that crashed into the Andes Mountains. With no food in the barren, snow-covered mountainous landscape, the survivors attempted to eat anything from the plane that seemed even remotely edible, like cotton and leather from the plane seats. Some of them even got sick from trying makeup powder and cologne from the luggage. On the brink of death, the survivors looked to the bodies of their frozen comrades who had perished in the crash for sustenance. With a choice between certain death and doing the unthinkable to live, they chose to live. Adrift in the middle of the Pacific, Jose also contemplated choosing death by his own hand to ease his terrible, prolonged suffering. But as a devout Christian, he was afraid that committing suicide would prevent him from entering heaven. Rather than face potential eternal damnation, he decided to press on, convinced that all this suffering would end one way or another. To keep his hopes and confidence up, Jose created a different reality. Every time he woke up at sunrise, he imagined he was waking up in his bed. When he walked from one end of his boat to another, he imagined he was going on a leisurely walk through the park. When he ate raw fish, he pretended he was having a gourmet meal. More importantly, Jose thought of his family, especially his daughter, whom he hadn't spoke to for years. He made a vow, if he was to survive this ordeal, he would keep his family closer to his heart. Days, weeks, and months churned on as he battled bouts of hopelessness and despair. His body, sore from the sun and sea's exposure, hurt with each move he made, with only a tattered sweatshirt as a frail shield to nature's elements. At night, he took shelter in a skiff's cooler, alone, tired, and frightened. The cooler was now his home. Unfortunately, the ocean currents carried Jose's skiff far away from any shipping lanes, which are like the established roads and highways of the ocean, so no boats ever crossed his path. He could see the outlines of ships on the horizon, but they were too far away, and he didn't have a flare gun or any other sort of signaling device to attract their attention. At one point, there was actually a ship that he thought had sailed close enough to signal for help. So he jumped up, waving and shouting, but it ended up being a waste of what little energy he had left. The ship's personnel weren't able to hear him, and his skiff was too low in the ocean to be seen. His ordeal in the ocean, his starvation, dehydration, and loneliness was about as extreme as it gets. He became used to seeing mirages and hallucinations that, coupled with his alternate reality, made Jose wonder if he had indeed become insane. But as Jose woke up on his 438th day, he saw something new. Coconut husks floating by the boat and seagulls skimming the water's surface. Looking out the horizon, he saw the unmistakable profile of an island. At first, he thought it was just another hallucination. But this island stayed in his vision for a long time, not like the fleeting images that would disappear within a blink. Jose realized that he was actually looking at a real island. And best of all, the current was leading his skiff towards it. Jose knew that this was it. This was the last chance of salvation. He had to make sure that his boat continued to drift towards it. Using his knife, he cut the floating buoys that had been serving as floating stabilizers for the craft in rough water but were now only slowing him down. Without the buoys, the skiff sped towards the island with the waves. It took half a day before Jose got within 10 yards of the shore and jumped into the water, leaving the boat that had been his home for more than a year, and swam towards the sandy beach. His relief and happiness were indescribable as he crawled weakly ashore, clutching handfuls of sand. He was on dry land at last.
The Pacific Ocean has thousands of rocks, islands, and reefs. How could he be so sure that he hadn't just washed up on an uninhabited island, cursed to suffer a fate only marginally more preferable than the last?
That was what Jose thought at first, but then, a short distance from him, he spotted two locals near a tiny beach house. With the last of his strength, he frantically jumped, shouted, and waved at them, the first humans he had seen since Ezekiel died. The locals, Emmy Lebakmedo and Russell Lekadirik, were drying coconuts when they saw a malnourished, bedraggled, disheveled, naked man clutching a knife, waving at them, and shouting desperately in Spanish. It's safe to say they were quite apprehensive about approaching a man in a crazed-looking state, yelling at them in a language they didn't understand, but eventually, after realizing he was just a harmless castaway who desperately needed their help, they invited Jose into their home and gave him his first proper meal in over a year. It was January 30th, 2014, and after 438 days of hell, Jose Alvarenga was finally rescued. He didn't know it yet, but Jose had drifted onto Tile Islet, a small islet that is part of the Eben Atoll at the tip of the Marshall Islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Marshall Islands is one of the most remote spots on the planet and one of the most difficult to reach places on Earth. That's why it was chosen as a site for U.S. nuclear bomb tests between 1948 and 1958. Jose had drifted a total of 6,710 miles through the central Pacific Ocean. Had he missed Eben Atoll, the next possible landmass would have been the eastern seaboard of the Philippines, which would have been more than 3,100 miles away. Jose was taken to a hospital in the Marshall Islands for treatment. He had lost a lot of weight due to dehydration and starvation. He was anemic, which meant he had insufficient healthy red blood cells to carry oxygen to his body's tissues. He struggled with walking due to swollen ankles. His blood pressure was unusually low, and understandably, he had developed hydrophobia, an intense fear of water. But other than that, his vital signs were fine, which, all things considered, was remarkable. A little too remarkable. After 11 days in the hospital, Jose recovered enough that he was finally sent home. His family, including his daughter, who he had sworn to reconnect with, was overjoyed that he was alive. But upon returning home, Jose was faced with another battle. The battle to prove to the world that he was telling the truth. After all, Jose's story, surviving alone for more than a year in the middle of the ocean with nothing but a boat and an empty fish cooler, simply didn't seem possible. For example, it's difficult to believe that Jose did not develop scurvy without eating any fruits and vegetables. However, researchers have said that fish, bird, and turtle meat could have provided him with enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy. Was the vessel that washed up on Tile Islet the same boat that Jose had been living in for the entire year that he was marooned? It could have been a different boat. To confirm, officials tracked down Rodriguez, Jose's employer, who confirmed that the registration number of the boat he had washed up in was the same as the one that had left port on November 17, 2012, and vanished. Records and testimonies from agencies and citizens of Costa Azul confirmed Jose and Ezekiel were indeed fishermen who had gone missing, and files of the fishing boat were dug up to see that it was indeed the boat the men used, also confirmed as missing. Rescue officials also confirmed that they had received information that a fishing boat was missing from their area on that fateful November morning. They searched for 2 days before calling off the search after bad weather and heavy fog set in. Other people could hardly believe how far Jose drifted. However, oceanographers and researchers provided a model of the boat's course based on wind and current conditions. They correctly guessed that the boat would end up within 120 miles of the Eben Atoll, where Jose had ended up. Military survival specialists were consulted to review and assess Jose's descriptions of how he survived on the boat. They all agreed that Jose's methods of survival were legitimate and entirely plausible. To top it all off, on April 14, 2014, Jose passed a polygraph test. With all the evidence only giving legitimacy to his story, the press finally published and acknowledged Jose's story as true. He stands on record as having the longest time a person has survived adrift at sea. But surprisingly, there was still one final hurdle that Jose had to overcome. It was a battle for his honor, dignity, and $1 million. You see, Jose told his tale to journalist Jonathan Franklin, who published it as a book titled 438 Days, An Extraordinary True Story of Survival at Sea. After the book was published, Ezekiel's family sued Jose for $1 million. They accused him of cannibalizing Ezekiel to survive, which Jose vehemently denied. Jose's lawyer was able to defend his client, and the accusation was dismissed. Sadly, the book only sold less than 2,000 copies in the US, and no studio has shown interest in making his story into a movie. So, just as quickly as Jose became a sensation, everyone except those close to him forgot about his journey, which remains one of the greatest ever ordeals undertaken by a human being. Nevertheless, Jose Alvarenga's incredible story of survival is solid proof of the immense strength of the human spirit, a strength that rivals the immensity of the great Pacific Ocean. Hopefully, Jose's tale stays alive as a warning for generations to come. And if you enjoyed it, hit the subscribe button down below. You'd be surprised to know just how big of an impact just your one subscription has. And if you're interested in hearing the full story I mentioned earlier of the plane crash survivors who were forced to eat the dead bodies of their friends and loved ones to survive, click the thumbnail on your screen to watch now.